Welcome to our special webinar. We're calling it the recap of the most recent international study tour with our emerging cherry leaders and the 10th International Cherry Symposium catch up. So, thanks everyone for being here tonight. We've got a pretty jam-packed evening, but we have had a little bit of technical difficulty, so we've got to change around the agenda a little bit, which is no problem. So we were going to have a quick chat from Penny Measham, our new CEO of Cherry Growers Australia. But unfortunately, we've got a little bit of tech difficulty there, and Penny can't get her camera. So we're going to save that one for maybe a bit later in the night. But we'll start with a little bit of an overview of what happened on the study tour and then some of the key insights from the International Cherry Symposium and what the growers learnt. I'm then going to pass over to some of the growers that attended that trip, who will hopefully give you guys a little bit of an insight and talk a little bit more about the technical things that we learned and how that's implemented back on the orchard. And then I'll give you guys an opportunity to have a quick chat to them. And if you've got any questions, please pick their brains. I've already worded them up that they might get a few from the audience. So, yeah, keep them on their toes. So I have titled this, Can We Learn Anything from the Americans? Question mark. And maybe that's a little bit controversial at the moment, but I made this presentation last week, so hopefully I'm in the clear. Oh, okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, we'll do some key insights from the study tour and then the new research that everyone should hopefully have on their radar or be following in some way, and then yeah, the highlights from our different cherry leaders. Oh, what's going on here? I'm having technical difficulties too. There we go. Okay, so I felt a little bit of pressure having to pull this group together. Now, we actually have 14 emerging cherry leaders who have started a leadership program funded by Hort Innovation and co-invested from the growers themselves. And this program runs for 18 months. It was a competitive selection process, and we are catching up doing lots of different in-person activities and webinars, and hopefully build a community of leaders that will take over the Australian cherry industry in those board positions or SIAP positions, all leaders coming from all growing regions across Australia. So the reason why we went to the US was because the International Cherry Symposium was being held in Richland this year, and we thought it was a great opportunity to get the growers over, see Washington State, get into a few of the orchards over there, and then attend that conference. So this is the group that was able to come along to the study tour. We don't have everyone that's involved in the emerging cherry leaders, but yeah, this group widely represented our key production areas. We've got Tassie, Vic, and New South Wales who were able to come along. And as I said, I've got some of the brightest and keenest growers here standing on top of a mountain, plus Doomy, who was part of the trip as well and instrumental in getting this group together. So it was great. Normally, as you all probably know, I work with a lot of the industry's parents, quotation marks. So working with a lot of these guys who often I see on the farm, but they might not be as heavily involved in the day-to-day operations, but definitely involved in the business and taking over that next stage. And these guys will be the ones in 10 years' time, or I mean, even in a couple of years' time, that will be at the forefront of our industry. And as you can see, we have got a largely dominated boy population, but we've got Clem and Paris both flying the flag for the women in the industry as well. So we started off in Seattle, Washington. So we all flew into Washington, and then we made our way east across into Wenatchee and down through Mattawa, Quincy, into Prosser, and then finishing up in Richland. So our first stop was at Wenatchee, and we were looking at all things soil microbes. So This actual trial site that you're seeing here is one from Washington State University, and they're trying to look at improving their soil in terms of structure, but then also microbiology. So trying to get those nutrients in, because as you can see, Wenatchee is a desert, and they're literally planting those trees straight into sand. So um, they need to be able to build a environment where the tree is going to be able to sustain itself, be able to withstand itself up structure wise, but then also be cycling those nutrients for those top quality cherries. Little side note about the desert conditions in Wenatchee. So we were all pretty shocked that it was stinking hot and very sandy, with these clear blue skies. Now, that's quite different to what we might experience in cherry season in Australia. Often we're challenged with rain at the inappropriate times, but the conditions here in Wenatchee, 300 mils of rain a year. They've got blue skies, all the sunshine in the world, and the ability to pump from the Columbia River is the main, I guess, benefit of being in these conditions. So they could control the environment quite significantly. That was seen throughout Washington State, where these desert conditions, they've got low rainfall, but all the water in the world, and they'd be able to produce these really high quality cherries. So that was quite interesting for us. And having the conversations about how they manage their soil was a great place to start the tour, because we're kind of starting from the ground up. So this particular trial, sorry, back on track, is looking at under tree management. So they had compost, which is the picture in the middle that you can see here. They had a mow and throw system where they mowed the interrow and then pushed the mulch out onto the tree line. And then they're also putting in some cover crops, which was where on the right-hand side here was going to go, but obviously the trees have just been put in the ground. So it was a great place to start in the soil microbes. Our next stop, and carrying on the desert theme and hot, was all about protective covers. And so we saw a lot of orchards actually that had implemented covers, not for hail and not for rain, but for a shading effect. So a lot of these conditions are quite hot. When we were over there, it was about 37 degrees at the start of their cherry growing season, so quite warm before the real heat comes later on. And a lot of these growers were putting overhead sprinklers plus the shade sail, and then trying to just cool down that ambient temperature in the orchard. So I'll talk a little bit further when we get down to Mattawa and towards Yakima, but doubling in fruit is quite a prolific problem in the US. And so implementing these adaptation options to cool the canopy is quite critical in a lot of their orchards. And so you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner there, we've got an orchard with very translucent netting, but that creates a shading effect and then the opportunity to run the overhead irrigation over the top as well. So we're having a couple of conversations around how to manage your vegetation under those systems, and you can see in that right-hand corner, a lot of vegetative growth comes off those systems when you're increasing the humidity under those nets, and then also creating an environment that might be more optimal for vegetation. So a lot of things to think about as well. I'm a bit of a horse mad girl, so when I saw this horse as well, I had to include it in the presentation because it was beautiful right next to the orchards. And I just noticed there's a portaloo there too, so that probably defeats my pretty picture.
Oh, it could be, man.
Our next stop was at Standout in Wenatchee. So they're one of the largest packing houses in Washington State. And we were lucky as a group to actually get in there a few days before cherry harvest had started. And so they were trialing all the lanes and all the equipment and the graders. And I guess a few of us, especially the guys that work in the pack houses or have pack houses on their orchard, might have had a little bit of PTSD or got a little bit excited when they were hearing the tappity tap of the caps shooting off the line. So we were lucky enough to go through the whole pack house from the start. right through to their cool storage and then their distribution facility at the end. And so Stamilk actually packs 1,200 tons of cherries a day, which is insane if you think about our global production of 20,000 tons a year, 1,200 tons a day. You're pretty much up to our national crop in 3 weeks, which is crazy. And then they're trying to integrate their waste system into an opportunity for their growers to be able to use as compost. So trying to really circular economy that packing house. Interestingly, 3 of the people that we met at Stamilt are all Australians and used to work in the Australian cherry industry. So it was great to have them show us around the pack house and really talk about all the different comparisons between America and Australia, just having a different lens and perspective as well to listen from. I can probably talk about all the different orchards that we visited. We visited nearly 5 a day, but I think I'll just stick to some of the highlights and key ones that we did see. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. But the next stop that we had was moon cherries in Wenatchee. So moon cherries, a bit of an interesting concept, and I think many growers on the call tonight probably have heard of Kyle Matheson and his moon cherries in Wenatchee. But we got to spend time with Kyle and talk about some different aspects of cherry growing. His main highlight to tell the growers was all about telling your story and making sure you can stand out amongst your peers as well. So he did talk about the industry being a whole, but we're also trying to diversify our own stories and make our own niches as well. And I mean, if you've got hundreds of cherry growers in one town like Wenatchee, you want to make sure that people remember you. And so his orchard is 1/4 mile higher to the moon. So he calls himself Moon Cherries, which I thought was pretty interesting, that just that little catchphrase that everyone can then remember. Kyle also spoke more about the use of organic materials like compost and seaweed, again, to improve those microbes because of those sandy soils in Wenatchee. And he also talked about the uniformity across the canopy, so making sure that every tree is as similar as its neighbor. And you can see as you look over in those right-hand side, the trees are very nicely pruned. They all look the same, getting that uniformity for that uniform quality in the cherries. One of the other interesting things that Kyle talked about as well was when you're competing against each other for labor, you want to be able to set yourself aside from the other orchards as well, and maybe and make it a fun place to work every day in the orchard. And so he was talking about his incentives that he gets his workers to try and keep morale, particularly around harvest time. And he was talking about giving the growers the opportunity to have chocolates every day. So going around and seeing them all and giving the pickers the chocolates, and also talking about ensuring that they had Sundays off to be able to go to church because they're a very faith-based system over there. And just those little things that tried to set him aside from other orchards. Very interestingly, when we're talking about labor, obviously Australia has that really high wages and makes it difficult for us to be able to compete and have margins, I guess. But it was interesting to hear that despite what we thought, wages are just as high as Australia in Wenatchee and in Washington State. So Kyle here was paying about $19 US, which is around about $35 an hour. And that's very similar to what we see here in Australia. So just thinking a little bit about how they capitalize on ensuring that keeping their wages and those margins that we're getting is quite similar to Australia. One of the things that took me back was the amount of plantings going in the ground. And Clem's probably going to kill me for this photo, but Ruben and Clem, so happy to see more trees going in and seeing the production increase. But some of the conversations that we were having over in Washington State were that already they're at a kind of domestic glut and how they were going to move some of this fruit. But most orchards that we went to had new plantings. So it would be interesting to see in the US what happens as we move towards the future, where this crop is going to go and how they're going to combat that extra production coming online, which is not too dissimilar to here in Australia, where we also have lots of new plantings going in. And as an industry, we probably really need to think about what's going to happen with that new production and where we're actually going to put it. And do we need to start diversifying on our markets already to be able to move some of that fruit that we might see in 10 to 20 years? I'm just going to draw your attention to as well to that bottom left-hand corner where we did see a few spray carts and orchard workers sitting on tractors that are opened air and spraying, which we thought was just crazy because in Australia you wouldn't see that anymore. But just the American way, I guess, that they had just a little respirator and a little suit and they were going along spraying in that orchard. So very different to what we experience in Australia now. Another challenge that the Americans face, and this was pretty much every orchard that we went to, was little cherry virus. And this is just rampant through Washington state, which is quite devastating. As you can see, the tree is just severely compromised by this virus. And the only way you can deal with it is by taking the full tree out of the ground and starting again. And so there's a lot of research going into managing little cherry virus and detecting it and making sure that they're keeping on top of it. But just hammered home the realities of us getting something like this into Australia, which we do know it has been present before, but making sure we get on top of it and try and manage it as best as we possibly can, because we don't want a situation like the US where we've got little cherry virus in every one of our orchards, and it really compromises the ability to put on good quality fruit and yield per block as well. One of my favorite stops along the way, and maybe the growers will agree, but I might be a little bit biased because these guys are probably the more experienced counterparts in Washington, but we were lucky enough to be shown around the Prosser Tree Crop Institute with Matt Whiting and Bernadita Soldato. And so Matt and Bernadita were able to show us through their different facilities and the different projects that they're working on currently with Washington State and the growers in Washington. And so that little left-hand corner there, you've got Matt, and he's describing some of the research that they work with on growers around quality. They have their own little grading facility, which I was very envious over, so they don't have to do any handheld quality samples for their research trials. But they were talking about how the growers have a investment into the research and they're very keen on learning new things and being a part of the research in Washington State and making sure that they're on the forefront of new varieties, new techniques of growing, new training systems. And so it was quite interesting listening to Matt about how much that they value research and development in their industries. We then went out into the field and we were able to see a new variety trial, which had new low chill varieties within the block, but also a lot of older varieties, but on different training systems, and looking at how these varieties interact with different rootstocks, and if the growers were able to see differences and potentially maybe select based off what they were seeing in these test blocks. And so having a chat to some of the growers as well on the tour, is this something that Australia could implement for our industry? Is this variety rootstock interaction where you can come on and you can see, does Lappin's on Colt work with a UFO or a Spanish spindle, or what does that look like? And so that could be something that we explore a little bit further into the future as well. And this is probably one of the prettiest orchards that we saw in terms of that pristine fruiting wall. And so this was Allen Brothers, and you're looking at Skeena on Mazzard rootstock. So they produce about 12 tons a hectare on this system. And as you can see, it's super high density and that fruiting wall that we're trying to get. And so we're talking about the opportunity for mechanical harvesting on this block, the use of mechanical platforms, and trying to get this as labor efficient as possible. There was some challenges, particularly around maintaining that fruiting wall and vigorous summer pruning and training people to be able to set this system up. But as you can see, the light penetration with the modeling on the ground of that distributed light, you can see the light all through that canopy. It's quite a good system to try and push quality in here. Again, you can see the overhead sprinklers, and they're actually baiting down the interrow for rodents as well. So that was something that we don't usually do in the orchard, but a big problem that they do see in Washington. And one of our last stops, actually, before we ended up in the tour, was Mark Hanrahan's orchard. Now, I think he took that Australian stereotype a little bit seriously, and we rocked up, and he said, "Oh, the Australians are here. I've got some beers in the back for you," and we all laughed. And he actually did pull out a heap of beers, so we were actually able to have a bit of a casual chat with Mark, all about his orchard. He's been doing this for a lot of years, trying to grow on new different systems and talking about the benefits of training, trialing, and doing your own research on your own block and not being afraid to try things as a little strip. So he was one of the most probably genuine growers that we saw who talk about their real experience. And so that was really good for our growers just to have a bit of a discussion around, not being afraid to fail and trying new things, and look, you're not always going to get the best results, but at least you tried, and you can move on and try something different in your orchard. And he was here with his blush cherries as well. And now I'll quickly jump through kind of the high level concepts that were spoken about at the International Cherry Symposium. So this year was the first year that they had a 50-50 split of growers and researchers in the room for that symposium. Generally, it is a research focused symposium, but as we see that transition from traditional research and more applied research and getting growers to be more partners in that, I think we see more of a shift between that grower and researcher and more working together. So that was great to see in the room. Australia had one of the largest contingents, which was great. And we actually saw some other Australian cherry growers come over and meet the group, which was great to be able to talk to them and bounce some ideas off what they thought around some of the things that we were seeing in the orchard, which was fantastic. And so we had researchers from Chile, from Israel, China, United States, all talking about different research that they've done in the cherry industry. So some of it was quite technical, and we took a little bit to get, the key concepts out, but these are probably the most high level concepts that were spoken about. So cherry production globally has increased by 18% in area and 48% in production volume. So that's tonnage, which is just crazy. What are we going to do with all that fruit? How are we going to improve our consumption both domestically and globally of cherries? And that kind of led into thinking about the promotion of cherries more from a health benefit perspective. So I don't know, my dad gets gout. I'm not sure if anyone else gets gout on the call, but cherries are apparently an amazing fixer of gout. So maybe we need to start thinking about that kind of aspect, as well as that they're delicious, they're fun, they're beautiful, they're a gift, but also they're a health benefit. Like I mentioned before, the use of protective covers, not only for rain cracking, but for shading and inducing dormancy. So a lot of these marginal areas were using shade covers to then accumulate chill and get enough in their orchard, which was crazy to think about that they were using that to accumulate chill portions. Disease detection with canines, and literally canines, so dogs. So we watched this video of these dogs being able to detect little cherry virus just by running up the rows as if they were in an airport picking out contraband at an airport. They were picking out little cherry virus and actually quite high um, accuracy rates. So that was really impressive to see that potentially something like that could work in an Australian system where we have little amounts of a disease and we can accurately detect it and eradicate it. So that was really interesting. A lot of talk about crop load management with chemical thinning and the importance of getting those self varieties right. Something that I know I was talking to a growers on the trip, thinning is quite common, but how can we work to best get our crop load management, particularly with those new chemical thinning techniques? I know a lot of people on the call are probably apple growers, and so it's quite second nature. But how do we get that into our cherry orchards as well? And so on the crop load conversation, thinking about varieties like Regina and Skeena that are prone to those internal browning, some of the researchers were talking about effectively managing that through crop load and getting the right crop on the tree to then be able to avoid those internal browning issues. A lot of work on climate resilience. So looking again, yeah, protective covers, overhead sprinkling, low chill variety. And then we had a lot of conversations. There was a big Chilean cohort, and some of the conversations around lunch and dinner were all about their reign on the Southern Hemisphere market and how we were going to work with them, or diversify to ensure that Australian cherries were still going to be those number one cherries on the market. And so this was just on the left-hand side, we've just got an orchard here, which I think will be an orchard of the future. You've got the frost fans in the background. You've got the reflective mulch trying to improve that quality, and then you've got the light drappling through fruiting wall as well. So I got all of our cherry growers who were on I say cherry growers. They're all from, we've got agronomists, we've got exporters, we've got a few different people who make up our emerging cherry leader group. But I got them all to write me a paragraph with some of the quotes that some of their highlights and some things that we need to improve on. So straight from their mouths, we've got visiting researchers and growers looking at different systems was some of the highlights. Juan Pablo, we all love Juan Pablo, talking about his post-harvest research, looking at growing on a really tight margin. So investing in maintaining their big yields. And then also that it was great that the group were able to all connect together over the 2 weeks. So in summary, before I pass over to our growers, we've got quantity doesn't mean you get quality. You do need to work for it. And that was quite interesting to hear because we did see a lot of high volume orchards. And although they did speak about quality and they did have some implementation of, the reflective covers and things like that, were they actually hitting the mark and getting those big yields, or is there room to work? And I think the latter might really be true. Tell your story. Cherries are hot and sexy commodity. Make sure that you are telling that story to the consumers so we can move some of that global tonnage that we're going to be seeing in the future. Tree canopy structure is an art and you need to work at it, which is probably nothing new that we're talking about here. Climate resilience, cherry breeding, and canopy management are top global research priorities. And in Australia, we are challenged with our climate, but let's look to some of this new research to see if we can combat it. And so a big thank you again to Hort Innovation for providing this funding for us to be able to take the growers over there. And like I mentioned, it was a 50-50 contribution from the growers themselves to be able to come on to the tour and participate in the program as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass over to some of our emerging leaders. Rube said he was going to start first. So, Rubes, do you want to come on and maybe give us a bit of a highlight, your highlights, maybe some lowlights? I'm not sure. Is he still on here?
You should be.
Yeah, maybe not.
Maybe start with Matt.
Matt Batnick, you're going to start.
Oh no, I can't find my unmute button. No, look, I'd just like to start with thank you very much for everybody attending tonight, but also, Jess, it's very hard to follow with that because you've covered absolutely every the highs and the lows of every single detail of what is the US cherries and how they operate and how best they perform. A big take home from me, I think we really need to have a huge discussion of at the start, really their training practices have leaps and bounds from the late 80s. They've gone from where we are now, where we're still dealing with the KGB tree structures, and they're going into more intensive plantings. So, like higher density plantings with trees that are um, twice the size of ours, to put it frankly.
Mm,
With on the simple side of things, you've got trees there that are 4 liters, and they're talking about sets per tree of a ladder. So they're still using a lot of ladders. That's probably one thing. Like they are talking a lot about platform pruning, platform picking. That is the way of the future. I think a couple of things that we need to remember though is the cost of labour is quite similar, but ours is quite high. They've got some benefits in this area that we went to, more or less, in Wenatchee and the Greater Basin of, Mattawa and Yakima and everywhere. They've got hydropower, so 3 cents a kilowatt for their power. So that they're already on a pretty good head start. What are we, mostly in New South Wales, Victoria? 25, 35 cents a kilowatt. So there's a few gaps there if we're growing and packing and pumping water.
mm,
Water for them, I know just in our area, we have some pretty harsh water. We don't have a river running past us. So we kind of have those battles. So we don't have the advantages of having a river from snowmelt running past with, yeah, they've got high calcium water and whatnot. It's fantastic that everything's sort of working out reasonably well for on that side of them. They've got drip irrigation, they've got sprinklers and whatnot. They they do have a lot of heat issues. I think we can probably compare ourselves to them within reason with their heat issues. We mightn't get as bad, but we do have growing climates in Australia. I know up there in Cobram, well, down in Cobram is a little bit, in Calignan and whatnot. There's some pretty decent heat that runs through there and Griffith areas. So the use of surround on their trees, both pre-harvest and post-harvest, not too early in pre-harvest though, mind you, because you won't get it off, but they're stopping a lot of doubling post-harvest more or less, using those sort of sprays. Yeah, look, there's a lot in the way of building carbon within the soil. I think we've always growers been trying to build our carbon levels so we can retain moisture and really help our trees have a good kickstart. So it's really hard. Jess, you've covered so much and all that. Has anyone else got any questions or any bump anything in? Matt, Monty, you got anything?
yeah, Mons, do you want to have a chat? Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, tough act again to follow. To me, basically, the big takeaway was it's a big world. There's a lot of problems, but everyone around the world's fighting the same battle, especially labor management, labor cost, pest disease, figure management, and food quality. We're all fighting the same battles, and that was a great lesson and takeaway from the conference was there's a lot of people out there we can now reach out to. We now have contacts with Matt Whiting, Bernadita, people all through Europe, just to try and improve our understanding, improve our knowledge and how to manage these issues. A big example that Jess touched on was that canine detection of wild cherry virus, and I think that could be pretty critical in the future going forward. You touched on it, but it's really debilitating in the states, and it really is wiping out orchards uh, across the state. fortunately, we're lucky to not have it in a massive way yet. But that's sort of technology which is really scalable, pretty cost efficient, and 99.79% accurate is pretty groundbreaking. And that's sort of technology and transfer that we could get from from the country. That's a big takeaway. And also just to be able to it further increased the cohesion in the industry with that group of 10 growers we had on that tour, just that we're all communicating. I was talking to Michael Tarver this afternoon, which wouldn't have happened before the tour. So it just increases that cohesion through the industry.
Thanks, Morns. Mike, anything from you?
Yeah, you asked a good question at the start of this talk. Is there anything we can take away? And the others have certainly said yes. I'm going to be a little more hesitant on that. I think perhaps the key thing when looking at the US is understanding the business or the game you're in versus the game they're in. They're doing a lot of volume. The 12 tons to the acre that Allen Brothers had is more like 30 tons to the hectare here. Those trees are twice the height of ours. I think they're 16, 18 feet tall. How they're balancing that with the labor costs of extracting it, I think Australia is actually in front in some of that when it comes to keeping on track of our costs and how are we, giving ourselves as much margin as possible. They've got a lot of 26, 28. I know in Tassie where we don't have some of the issues you guys have on the mainland, but we're pushing for bigger fruit than that, and we're pulling back our harvest yields to make sure we hit that, and that's not what the Americans were doing. Certainly, talking to some of the other countries there as well, particularly there seems to be a bit of a, dare I say, an arms race for who can get the earliest season cherries, the first into the market. And that seems to be a lot of what their breeding programs are focusing on. Early hot regions to get them there and low chill so they can actually get a crop on them. That would probably work quite well for places like Young, Mildura Way, where you are racing to get into the market. But, the lessons that might apply there won't apply necessarily to Tassie because we are on the back end of the season and there's no real benefit unless you're chasing just the Christmas market to try and race for early. So, it's about understanding your business, your district versus what they're doing. Kyle Matheson's orchards, I found were a real eye-opener. I mean, I'm at Jericho and we're one of the highest sites in Tassie. And we're maybe 1,000 feet. No, probably 1,200, 1,400 feet. Those orchards that Jess showed were at 3,000 feet, and the newer plantings were at 4,000 feet. And they looked so happy and healthy for places that got down to minus 17 in winter. Like, the stuff they're doing, certainly around plant health and vigor, that I think we would do very well to bring back. And it might be those microbes. It might be the hardiness, like all the high altitude stuff was on Mazard. Things that are going to give you that vigor to drive it. The other thing is that from what we're hearing from the markets, from the growers over there, their markets are really tight. And as much as growers over there like trellis, unless they were investing other people's money, they wouldn't invest in trellis because they couldn't necessarily see that they'd ever get their money back. So we're seeing a lot of those steep leader systems. Some of them certainly were running UFO, but most of them seem to be running UFO on blush cherries because as they often point out to us, they were what was making the money, particularly from an export context. And again, it was about being early. And with the blush cherries, kind of like apples, you have to get that light management right and get that. That was the image you showed with the reflective films. It was about light back into the canopy for blush cherries.
Yeah.
So those are some of the key things I took away. I don't think we're necessarily playing the same game. Rain covers, not a thing over there. Just touched on it. I think I looked at some stats and said they get maybe 40 mil over the 4 months leading up to and including harvest. Like, rain just isn't a thing. It's maybe 5 mil a month. Whereas we can get 40 in a day. Big difference. So we've got the margin to pay for things like covers to some extent in Tassie, and over there they think you'd just be throwing your money away. Interesting, the Israelis were talking about using black nets to give yourself better winter chill and stuff like that. In Tassie, we've got overhead bird net on basically every orchard across the state. We've got rain covers rolling out increasingly across the state, and so there's questions around how much light, and it was interesting to see the Chileans working on that. Some really interesting lessons to come out of there. And perhaps we should get Marlene as a future speaker. But yeah, they're just some of the ones from me.
Thanks, Mike. Does anyone have any questions from the audience at all for the guys or from the presentation? And feel free to use the chat if you want as well.
Yeah, hi, Jess. Just a quick question, Barisha here. Do they still call everything Bing over there, or have they moved on?
They've moved on.
Oh,
I
thank
think
God.
the new
For sure.
one's Skeena. Skeena's everywhere, I think.
What's the flavour? Skeena, is it?
Skeena, Santina, Black Pearl. There's a lot of Black Pearl plantings going in. They seem to be the new, as you, Barisha, you probably know, the coral, champagne coral over there used to be a massive thing. So at the moment, they're treating Black Pearl as the next big champagne coral. They're hoping that it's got a little bit better stemless, but it's quite precocious. So tonnage, they're sort of thinking it's a little bit like Santina, so they're pushing a lot of emphasis on trying to take a lot of buds out. So they're doing a lot of pollen harvesting and everything like that, and they're a lot of pruning to try and take them out. But yeah, Black Pearl seems to be the precocious one, the one that they want to produce the most. And you know what the States guys are like, they're just tonnage.
Interestingly, the Black Pearl, one of the growers was saying it's also to do with a licensing and royalty thing.
That's
So
a huge part, yeah.
I don't think there's a PBR on it, but they still have to pay per volume. It's one of those two payment systems they just don't have to do. And so it's putting them in front of other varieties where you'd have those extra costs. It just gives them back more margin.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Early Robins as well seem to be one we kept hearing all the time because that's their early blush one they're racing to market.
Yeah, there's quite a big program on blush, just moving away from Brainier alone, which has been a large part of their crop for a while. They're now moving into Early Robin and Skylar Ray. So there's the big development of that blush program.
The Rainier drink was pretty good, and the cherry was even better.
Guys, Edwina's asked a question. What role does biologicals play overseas? Morn, so I might pass to you for that one.
Biologicals. I mean, as you mentioned, they're dealing with a pretty low abiotic soil, so there's a lot of work going into mulch and compost. Probably not a huge focus over there, perhaps with their lower margins and perhaps lower focus on, high focus on yield first quality aspects. That was my take on it.
Yeah, I didn't hear them talk too much about putting on synthetic biologicals. It was more around just trying to get, like Matt Batnick talked about before, that carbon and organic matter into the soil rather than the synthetic. I mean, they're starting with a pretty low base already. But I mean, it's interesting to see that they're starting to think about that concept of building up the soil there.
Just an interesting, sorry, Jess, you might have some more questions there in the chat, but I know that the Cultiva guys were a pretty big sponsor, so the Parker company. They had a lot of talk about, and some of the growers were touching on that post-harvest, they wanted to do a lot of work with Parker in post-harvest, and some growers already had to reduce a lot of the stress on the plant. I think it's a very expensive option, but that was something that was being floated around a lot. But as the question was about the fungicides and whatnot, I reckon, I don't know about you guys that were all there, everyone was a little bit, they didn't really touch on too much of the chemical usage. They were pretty slow on that. I asked a lot of questions and got a lot of politician answers, a lot of sideways answers. So, but if there's
much lower fungicide usage, just
Yeah,
much
massively.
yeah.
But look at the rainfall. But it was interesting. They've got so much overhead sprinklers, a lot of irrigation use. I think the phrase was coined "pump baby pump." So like they keep going. I if there's one thing I could add to everything, I know this is a bit of a side note, but look, I can see a tsunami of cherries being grown in Australia, and we've got to pull our finger out and really do a lot of work on our export. That's going to be our next biggest hitter. If we don't really work on our export, there is that many cherries in the ground at the moment. We're not going to know what to do with. And the answer of pumping the cherries over like the US guys do and having upwards of 20% minor defects in the pack out boxes heading overseas to get repacked, or whether it be heading to China, and they're more than likely getting repacked as well, and into smaller cartons. We're going to have to either drive home our export strategy a lot harder and also focus on our quality, because we don't want to end up like that. Australian cherries are a premium cherry, and we got to. That was a big one for us. It's got to be premium, and we've got to do the right job, and we've got to achieve those high premium markets. We don't want to be pumping into wholesale markets anymore.
No, we don't want to be in Costco or Walmart.
No. Look, they play a role. It's part of the puzzle. It's a part of the tool in the toolbox. But we really got to work on our export markets big time. Australia's got something special, and we're not going to stop putting more cherries in. So we've got to work on that.
Just on that, I did some quick, back of the envelope maths, and it's pretty scary to think that like the Americans with their 200,000 tons, they produce 10 times more than we do, but they've got 14 times the population to eat them. So just bear in mind that our market is already probably more saturated than what the Americans are dealing with.
Oh, domestically, far more domestically, yeah. Hence the export.
Got another couple of questions, guys, in the chat. So, any significant mechanization happening throughout the orchard to reduce harvest and/or structure and training labor costs?
That's been a big. So Matt Whiting is a pretty big proponent of tree shaking, which then leads to stemless cherries, and there's pretty obvious quality issues with that. That's the path they're going down, which is probably partly a reflection of the volumes they're looking at and the market they're operating in. It's a way of doing it. It's one way of mechanically picking fruit.
And I mean, a lot of those orchards going to those trellis systems in the hope that mechanical platforms and things can be implemented. But we do know mechanical platforms also do have their challenges in terms of getting people to pick at the right speed and the right people to get on those, and how you coordinate people who are on the platforms versus people who are on the ground. But definitely, like the guy said before, moving towards that more trellis system as well.
Just on that one, there is some work they're doing with night picking in the States, particularly for quality. They're using a lot of brought-in labor, particularly from Mexico through their H2A program. Realistically, it looks very similar to our Pacific program, but you don't get to recoup any of the costs you spend bringing them in. But to make that work, they seem to be bringing in supervisors and stuff like that as part of the team. I don't know if they've got the same problems we'd have in Australia of getting all our orchard staff to suddenly be nocturnal. It's just not going to work. But yeah, a lot of work around platforms, particularly with that. A lot of the smaller growers aren't using platforms for picking because they realize that if they were going to go down that route, they'd need 60 of them. And last I checked, they were like $150,000 Australian each. So yeah, they're going, we don't have the margin for that. It's all ladders. Mechanization in the pack house seemed to be a big one. I mean, Standout was running with, I think, half the workforce that we at Reed Fruits would have in our pack houses in summer. And, they're doing 2.5 times the Australian crop in that. But as Matt pointed out, that's coming with 20 or up to 20% defect. And they're still having to repack some of that in the shed. Like, they're saving labour in some spots, but there doesn't seem to be any silver bullets or anything like that in the orchard. If anything, the fact that their trees are so high and there's so much ladder work, I think we're probably ahead of them on that one.
There was also a little bit of a touch on some growers, and I think it was more directed towards the milk. But to get those higher pack outs within the pack shed, they were talking about doing some culling in the orchard and paying upwards of I think it was correct me guys, it was $1.50 a pound or something like that, for culls in the orchard to try and get that higher pack out, basically. So look, another thing to really, within 3 hours of no matter which way the crow flies, you can hit an orchard, and a pretty decent orchard. So staff, like moving staff around is pretty easy up that way. So when you think about it, we're 2 and a bit hours to Orange. We're a few more hours to Shepparton and the likes, and down Victoria, Yark and Yarra Valley and whatnot, and well, Tassie as well. So I think labour's a huge problem for us, and we got to try and solve that pretty quick.
Mm. While we're on the pack house conversation, Penny, I will get to your question, but Karina's got one in the chat. Did you see any advancements or differences in packaging to improve freshness or anything, particularly in that milk that stood out?
Everybody, I hate to jump in straight away. Everybody seems to be going, they're feeling the pinch. So everyone's doing a much thinner board grade. So as it used to be beforehand, it would be structural, ready for export, making sure we're not getting square cherries over there. They're all changing their board grades. Everything's getting a lot lesser. There is a move from plastics a lot. In saying that, though, the old catch weight bags, there's a lot of that kicking around over there. So smaller packaging, more grab and go bags seem to be where it's at. I don't know whether everyone else in the group's seen that sort of thing. I think they were retailing for $4.69 or something like that US for grab bags, and the stores were littered with them. There was no loose cherries anymore. And look, there hasn't been in Australia for a while. So, but yeah, cheaper board grades, more grab bags, punnets. Punnets are huge. That's basically where they're making their savings.
Perhaps another thing just to be aware of when you look at the US is that most growers, even small and medium-sized ones, don't have their own pack house.
Yeah.
They're not that vertically integrated at that scale. It's going into large players.
Probably got time for one or two more guys. So
Penny's
were
question.
there... Oh, you're there, Geeta?
Yeah, Penny's question.
Yeah, I was just getting to Penny's. Were any challenges with export out of the US mentioned? Do they have concerns around meeting MRLs for export?
Yes, they were, but it was tariffs.
Yeah.
Fruit
The
fly.
tariff uncertainty was a big one for them because that can change from week to week. I mean, a lot of their product goes to places like China, and China's tariffing agricultural goods because that's what they import. So whether they even have their markets this year was still an open question. They were waiting and seeing. Fruit fly was touched on. We certainly asked about SWD, that's Waterwing Drosophila, but most growers didn't seem to think that was that much of an issue because they were already having to manage the local fruit fly. So.
Any other questions, guys? Thank you for everyone for participating tonight and getting the conversation going. Does anyone have any other burning questions or comments or even their own thoughts if they've been to the US before? One more, guys. With the higher yields and grab bags, has anyone tried marketing in bunches? Like grapes, I'm assuming. Is that like Peter?
I haven't seen any.
I don't think they talked about it.
No, but grading wise, that might make it hard. Your quality
Mm.
might have to be changed a little bit, but
Yeah.
yeah.
How are they managing pollination with Varroa and spotted wing virus? Mondi, maybe you.
I mean, America's had a lot more longer exposure, obviously, to varroa, and it seems like a lot of their bee population has developed pretty significant resistance. But as has been touched on, artificial pollination is actually surprisingly common over there. It's not happening across the board, but there's a lot of growers doing it. That I believe Hoi Innovation is actually looking into it within the Australian context, which is going to be great to watch going forward. But I think that's basically the two stories: resistance developing within their national beehive population, and artificial pollination supplementing that.
Mm.
Can I add a bit more on that?
Yep. Quickly.
Certainly in their dry conditions, getting bee activity doesn't seem to be a problem. So
No.
they're actually scaling hives back to try and reduce oversetting in some of the self-pollinating ones. I'm not sure we'd try that here in Tassie. We have enough trouble getting the bees to come out of the hives. So maybe we need to beat more hives with sticks or something. But yeah, so some of the things they're playing at, they're trying to save labour bills and scale back on their hive reliance.
Thanks, Mike. And last one, was there any mention as to which countries they want to target for future markets to absorb some of their volume?
China's still such a dumping ground. I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
India is
India's like Australia, more to Europe. Matt, you're dead right. It's India's a big one for everybody. It's on the up and up, but yeah, they're just looking for dumping markets.
And I think worth mentioning that their domestic market, it's more of just it's not a luxury product on the domestic market at all. It's every American can get a bit of cherries for a couple of dollars, which is crazy compared to what we pay over here. Another Chile then, yeah. Pretty much, but the opposite side.
Thank God they don't do it at the same time as
Yeah,
us.
I know. We've been a bit of strife.
It was interesting they have the same sort of market dynamics as us. I mean, we've got the Christmas and pre-Christmas market, and they basically have the same thing with 4th of July.
Yeah, that's what surprised me actually as well, was their interest in 4th of July. All right, guys, I'm going to have to pull up stumps there, but what I'm going to say is if you guys have any questions or comments or anything you'd want to ask the group, we've got a WhatsApp, and I can get onto these guys and happily ask them and get back to you if you want to email me any questions or leave any other questions in the chat, and we can get to them. But I want to thank Matt and Mike and Ruben when he's had some technical difficulties. He had to jump off. But thanks, guys, for sticking your hands up. It can be a bit daunting as well, talking to the large industry. So really appreciate your insights. And that was the most questions we've ever gotten on a webinar. So you guys can come back anytime. While I've got Doomy, I saw his face just before, but Doomy, thank you so much for supporting the group and coming along and putting up with this rowdy bunch. Your insights as well were very well appreciated, and I'm glad that Horde Innovation also got to see what they've invested in, and hopefully it paid off for them. And again, Geeta, thank you for tonight and putting this all together and getting everyone